I remember the day they installed the gate like it just happened yesterday. It was a warm Wednesday morning in early spring, and I was out in the orchard thinning the peach blossoms when I heard the grinding whir of metal on concrete. I looked up, sweat dripping down the brim of my old navy ball cap, and there they were, three men in yellow vests and hard hats, bolting down steel posts on either side of the road that ran straight through my land. My land. I walked down slowly, boots crunching over gravel, heart pounding with that familiar ache in my chest, an ache I'd come to know since the HOA started sniffing around my property line last year. It started with a letter, then a visit from a smug board member named Craig Winthrop, who said my orchard road, which had been used for nearly 30 years as a shared access route, was compromising the aesthetic unity of the subdivision. Now they were sealing it off. "What the hell is this?" I called out as I reached the base of the hill. The younger of the workers looked up, startled. "Just installing the gate, sir." "What gate? Who authorized this?" He didn't answer. Another worker handed me a folded paper. HOA Permit Approval, number 38, 201F. Craig Winthrop's signature was there in bold blue ink, along with the HOA's seal. They were calling it a privacy barrier for the benefit of the neighborhood. But I knew exactly what it was: punishment. Punishment for refusing to sign their new covenant agreement last fall. Punishment for refusing to attend their mandatory landscaping committee meetings. Punishment for reminding them over and over that this road wasn't part of their jurisdiction, never was. I had bought this land 20 years ago after retiring from the fire service. The orchard was my piece. I'd built the gravel road myself with the help of a few old buddies, firefighters, most of them, who'd come out with their trucks and tools on their days off. That road was my artery, not just to the main highway, but to the world. It was also the only reliable emergency access for the eastern slope of the entire neighborhood. And now it was being welded shut with a 14-foot black iron gate. I didn't yell, I didn't curse. That part of me had long since burned out. Instead, I walked back to the house, pulled out my old fire marshal binder from the cabinet under the stairs, and sat down at the kitchen table. The pages were worn, but still intact. Fire maps, district codes, easement laws, safety studies. I flipped through them slowly, breathing in the smell of paper and ash and coffee grounds. Then I called the number listed on the back of the HOA letterhead. "Winthrop here," the voice answered, crisp and self-important. "Craig, this is Daniel Rourke. I want that gate off my property by tomorrow." A pause, then a chuckle. "Daniel, it's not your property. That section of road crosses a tract we rezoned for HOA jurisdiction last year. It passed vote. You had your chance to attend the meeting." "I did attend," I said coldly, "and I told you then it was an easement. I've got maps, Craig, county maps, fire code maps. That road's not just for me, it's an emergency lane. It's been repurposed, and we've already informed emergency services to reroute if necessary." "If necessary." My voice tightened. "That gate delays first response by at least 15 minutes. You know that, don't you? It's a private matter now, Mr. Rourke, for the safety and privacy of our residents." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I sat alone on my porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the blinking red light on the gate flicker in the dark like some taunting sentinel. My orchard trees whispered in the wind, their blossoms fluttering like warnings, and I thought about all the years I'd spent teaching rookies how to assess burn perimeters, how to establish secondary access points, how to calculate wind direction in a blaze. I thought about how fragile a sense of safety could be when placed in the hands of arrogant men. And I remembered a boy named Eli Simmons from 26 years ago. A house fire on a cul-de-sac with one narrow road in and out, parked cars lining the street. Engine 6 had to stop 2 blocks away. By the time we got through the smoke and the heat and the screaming mother, it was too late. That night had never left me. And now, decades later, I was watching history, ready to repeat itself, except this time, it wouldn't be by accident. The HOA had taken a calculated step to prioritize privacy over preparedness. They didn't know it yet, but they'd lit a slow-burning fuse, and the spark had already touched the powder. They thought they were shutting me out, but what they were really doing was shutting themselves in. The next morning, I walked down to the gate again this time, with a worn leather folder tucked under my arm. The steel frame was already fully bolted in place, with a keypad access system mounted on one side and a sign reading, "Private Entry, HOA Residents Only." It was a beautiful spring day, clear and dry, the kind of day fire crews hate the most. Dry brush season was coming early this year. There'd been less rainfall than usual, and already the county had issued red flag warnings for the canyons east of us. One spark, one careless match or lightning strike, and the whole valley could go up like paper. And now, the only road cutting through the eastern slope had been locked behind a vanity gate. I knocked on the door of the HOA office, a small stucco building next to the clubhouse pool. Craig Winthrop answered, dressed in his usual pastel polo and khakis, like he was heading to a tennis match, not playing Overlord to 50 families. "Daniel," he said as if pleasantly surprised. "Didn't expect you so early." "I brought you something," I said, and held up the folder. He gave it a glance, but didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Proof. Fire code regulations, district, maps, evacuation flow. Charts, even a memo from the county fire chief, back when I still served, recommending that the Orchard Road remain open as a designated emergency lane." Craig raised his eyebrows. "This road hasn't been maintained by the county in years." "That's because I've maintained it, with my own equipment, my own time. And because I knew it mattered. You'd know that too if you'd ever stepped foot on it before blocking it off." He crossed his arms. "The HOA board voted unanimously to close it. Too many people using it as a shortcut. We've had complaints." "From who?" He smiled thinly. "Residents who value their peace and quiet, their privacy." "And what about their lives?" Craig didn't answer. He just stepped back into the office. "I'm giving you 1 week," I called after him, "to reverse this decision before someone gets hurt. Or worse." He paused in the doorway. "Mr. Rourke, I suggest you take this up with our attorney. Any further attempt to interfere with HOA projects will be considered harassment." The door shut. I stood there a long time, heart pounding behind my ribs. The sunlight shimmered off the fake stucco like heat from a far-off flame. I could feel the fight rising in my throat, hot, bitter, familiar. The same feeling I used to get when we arrived at a fire scene, too late. That afternoon, I filed an official complaint with the County Code Enforcement Office. I drove to City Hall with a binder full of maps and documents. The woman at the front desk listened politely, flipped through the papers, and told me they'd look into it, but that HOAs had increasing authority to regulate access roads if they were declared non-essential to public right-of-way. "They're not non-essential," I said. "They're critical. If a fire starts in the East Canyons, we won't have time to reroute." She nodded. "I hear you, sir. But it's hard to overturn HOA decisions unless a violation is directly tied to a life-threatening event." It was the cruel irony of emergency preparedness. You had to prove disaster before anyone took it seriously. Back at home, I started making calls to the fire station where I'd once worked, to old colleagues, now serving in the district office. I emailed photos, scanned maps, outlined risk scenarios. Some of them replied with concern, others with sympathy. But no one had the authority to override a private neighborhood's HOA decision unless the county formally intervened. Meanwhile, the HOA didn't waste a second retaliating. 2 days later, I received a notice of excessive equipment storage in my side yard. A second letter claimed my orchard exceeded permitted water usage under HOA guidelines, even though I had a private well. They threatened a lien if I didn't comply within 15 days. They were trying to bury me in paper, drown me in pettiness. But I wasn't some first-time homeowner who'd cave at the sight of official-looking envelopes. I'd stared down house infernos at 2 in the morning. I'd pulled charred bodies from basements. I'd fought real threats. This was just ego in a polo shirt. I gathered every violation letter into a neat stack and mailed copies to my attorney, a quiet woman named Denise Morales, who specialized in land use and had taken on more than one HOA bully in her time. "Can they legally do this?" I asked her during our first call. "They can try," she said. "But if your documents show that road is a designated emergency route, especially with fire risk in your area, we may be able to argue for an injunction. At the very least, we can force a hearing." "Good," I said. "Because if they think I'm just going to watch them lock the neighborhood into a fire trap, they picked the wrong damn person." Denise chuckled. "Sounds like they did." Still, the gate stayed up. I drove past it every day, watching the paint darken from weather and the keypad screen flicker in the afternoon sun. No one used it. No one questioned it. Most of the neighbors, I realized, had no idea that the road they once relied on was now sealed shut behind iron and ego. But I knew, and deep in my gut, I felt it coming. That tightness in the air, that weight on the wind. The kind of feeling that makes animals go quiet in the trees. All it would take was one ember, one spark, one gust. And when it came, it would come fast. And no one would be able to say they hadn't been warned. There's something about the smell of smoke that never leaves you, not just in your clothes or your hair, but in your bones, in your memory. Even years later, I can still smell it before I see it. The sharp sting of burning insulation, the acrid bitterness of scorched wood, and worse, the sweet, sickening scent of something unnatural burning. Plastics, furniture, people. I didn't become a fire marshal for the pension. I did it because I grew up in the dry edge of Arizona, where fires didn't just happen, they hunted. My father was a rancher, my mother a schoolteacher, and neither one of them ever forgot the summer of '83, when we watched an entire hillside go up like matchwood. Our neighbors barely got out. One didn't. I was 15 when I saw my first death up close. Not in war, not in a hospital. In a fire. That kind of thing changes how you look at roads, water lines, brush piles. It makes you see vulnerability in everything. I carried that with me through 26 years in the fire service. I'd seen houses flattened, pets lost, whole communities scrambling like ants from a kicked-over nest because someone lit a barbecue during a wind advisory or a power line snapped. I knew how fast chaos moved, how access mattered more than anything else. And I knew what it felt like to be too late. His name was Eli Simmons. He was 6 years old. We were called into a blaze in a gated community, just off Redwood Circle, mid-range houses, lots of two-car garages, HOA rules about mailbox height and fence colors. When we got there, the front gate wouldn't open. The code had changed the week before and nobody had informed dispatch. While the engine waited for bolt cutters, we ran. But the fire didn't. By the time we reached the Simmons house, the front was fully engulfed. His mother was outside screaming, clawing at the gravel, shouting that he was still inside in the upstairs bedroom. My captain tried to hold her back. I was the first one through the side. I found him curled under the bed, face streaked with soot body, limp blanket still in his hands. We did everything we could. CPR, oxygen, adrenaline. He was gone before we even got back to the truck. Later at the coroner's office, I stood in front of the steel drawer with his file in my hand, and I swore I'd never let infrastructure stupidity cost another life. Not on my watch. I started pushing for reform speaking at city meetings, working with counties to map fire lanes across the state. That's how I found this land. An old orchard plot outside city limits, but still close enough to provide alternate access to the hills. I bought it in 2004, poured everything I had into it, including my own back and knees. I kept that orchard road open because I knew someday it could make the difference between a close call and a tragedy. So when Craig Winthrop and his band of clipboard tyrants started talking about privacy fencing and limiting non-resident access, I knew exactly where it was headed. What stung more than the gate wasn't just that they didn't believe me, it was that they didn't care. They didn't want to hear about Eli Simmons, about Redwood Circle, about what it's like to cradle a lifeless child while the smoke still rises off their pajamas. They waved it off like I was telling ghost stories. And maybe I was, because ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt people. And I had more than a few clinging to my shoulders. The week after my warning to Craig Winthrop, the neighborhood newsletter went out. A little blurb near the bottom read, "New Orchard Security Gate installed. To improve neighborhood tranquility and protect homeowners from through traffic and trespassing, the HOA has completed the installation of the Orchard Gate. Thank you for your support in keeping our community safe." Safe, so I stared at that word for a long time. It didn't say anything about the road being an emergency lane, nothing about bypass access or evacuation plans, not a word about the elderly couple who lived near the canyon rim or the 3 kids in the last cul-de-sac whose parents worked nights. It was all about image, appearances, control. One evening, I saw a group of neighbors out walking their dogs near the gate. I approached, slowly trying not to come off confrontational. One of them, a woman named Erin, had always been polite to me in passing. "You know that gate slows emergency crews by at least 10 minutes, right?" I asked gently. She blinked. "Oh, I thought the fire department had keys." "Did they tell you that?" She hesitated. "I mean, Craig Winthrop said he gave them the code." No official code is registered with the district, I said. I checked. A man behind her frowned. Why would you check? Are you trying to scare people? I'm trying to protect people, I said. They looked unconvinced, suspicious, like I was the crazy old man waving warnings no one wanted to hear. That night, I sat by my fireplace and reread the old letters from Eli Simmons's mother. We'd stayed in touch for a few years after the accident. She told me she'd moved to a place with 3 exit roads, no gates, no HOAs. She sent a Christmas card once with a hand-drawn angel on it. I never told her that I still kept Eli Simmons's name pinned inside my turnout coat even after I stopped wearing it. The next morning, I emailed a full report to the local fire marshal's office. I attached drone photos of the blocked road screenshots of the HOA newsletter historical property maps and a full breakdown of the evacuation delays caused by the gate. It was the most complete fire risk profile I'd ever written outside of work, but the reply I got back was brief. Thank you for your submission, Mr. Rourke. We'll keep this on file in case of future incidents. In case of future incidents. That's the cruel thing about bureaucracy. It never moves until the smoke is already visible from the highway. But I had done what I could. Now I just had to wait for the wind to change. The first violation notice arrived, folded neatly in my mailbox, 3 days after I filed the complaint. It came in a cream-colored envelope with the HOA's gold seal embossed on the flap, like it was some kind of honor being reprimanded by them. Inside was a glossy, templated letter filled with official-sounding words like non-compliance, enforcement action, and final warning. At the bottom in red block letters, it stated, Violation Code 14.7b, Improper Equipment Storage. The presence of visible machinery tractor irrigation pumps tiller near the orchard's perimeter violates the HOA's visual uniformity standards and must be removed within 72 hours. I stared at the letter in disbelief. The orchard wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. The equipment they were referencing sat on all my land, not theirs. Machinery I used daily to maintain trees that had fed families and food banks for nearly 2 decades. My tractor had been there longer than half the board members had lived in this neighborhood. But I knew what this was. This wasn't about equipment. It was about intimidation. Retaliation. A warning shot wrapped in bureaucracy. I didn't respond. 3 days later, another envelope arrived. Violation Code 9.3a. Water Misuse Notice. Excessive water usage has been detected on your parcel. The HOA requires compliance with drought restrictions limiting irrigation hours and volume. That one nearly made me laugh. I had a private well drilled before the subdivision even existed. I'd paid for the permit myself, managed my own supply, and used less water per acre than any of the HOA-mandated sprinkler systems drenching ornamental lawns twice a day. But they weren't interested in facts. They were building a paper trail. Trying to bury me in so many small fires, I wouldn't have the time or energy to notice the larger one they'd started at the gate. I called Denise Morales again. She didn't sound surprised. They're trying to establish a pattern of disruption, she said. If they get enough of these on record, they can try to paint you as a hostile homeowner if this escalates legally. It's already escalated, I said. They're weaponizing code to silence me. They usually do. But keep every letter. Take photos. Document everything. They can't rewrite boundary maps, no matter how many violation codes they throw at you. So I did. I took photos of my tractor timestamped and GPS tagged. I printed out county water rights records and highlighted my well permit. I even set up a motion-activated camera facing the Orchard Road, just in case one of their goons decided to cross the line, literally or legally. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being prepared. There's a difference. But the part that hit hardest wasn't the letters or the games. It was what they did next. They sent a petition around the neighborhood. It was framed as a community safety and privacy agreement, asking residents to support further enforcement of the HOA's jurisdiction, including the Orchard Road, which they now claimed posed a high-risk entry corridor for strangers and trespassers. I read the petition headline 3 times before it truly sank in. They were calling my road, a security threat. They painted me as the one endangering the neighborhood. And it worked. Within a week, they had over 20 signatures. Some were from people I'd wave to every morning. Folks who used to buy fruit from my farm stand. A couple who once asked to take wedding photos in front of my blooming cherry trees. I don't think they truly understood what they were signing. The language was loaded, designed to spark fear and paranoia. Breach points, vulnerable perimeter open, exposure to non-residents. It read like the minutes of a military defense briefing. But the result was the same. I was now the outsider, the threat, the problem. That weekend, I drove into town to pick up some parts for my irrigation system. When I pulled into the hardware store parking lot, a familiar face crossed my path. Tom Blevins, a retired mechanic who used to help me weld pipe fittings back when I first bought the land. Tom, I nodded. He gave a half-hearted wave. Dan, everything okay? He hesitated, just trying to stay out of things. You signed it, I asked quietly. Tom looked away. They said it was just a formality, about safety, that you were trying to fight the board over road fees or something. They didn't mention the fire hazard, did they? No, just said you were causing trouble. I nodded, jaw clenched. Back home, I parked my truck and stood at the edge of my orchard looking out across the fence line. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a burnt orange hue over the trees. It was beautiful, and so damn fragile. Because the truth was, even with all my training and warnings, even with maps and evidence and legal counsel, I couldn't stop a fire once it started. No one could. All you could do was prepare hope and clear the path. But they were actively blocking it. And for what? A sense of control, a false feeling of privacy, an HOA newsletter. Bullet point. The land felt different now, colder, not because of the season, but because of what it meant when your neighbors stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as a problem. I locked up the gate behind me that night, not the HOA gate, but my own, the one that led to the tool shed, the water pumps, the barn where I stored all my emergency gear. Then I sat on the porch with a pad of paper and began writing a different kind of list. Not of violations, but of names. People who would need help when the fire came. People who might need saving even if they didn't think so now. Because despite everything, I wasn't the kind of man who stood by and watched others burn. Not again. The day it happened started off deceptively quiet. It was mid-July, and the heat had settled over the hills like a thick wool blanket. The kind of heat that makes your lungs feel like paper, the kind that sucks every drop of moisture from the soil, the air, the leaves. Even the birds had stopped singing. I was up early before the sun breached the ridge, walking the orchard rows with a clipboard and a grim look on my face. The trees were stressed leaves curling in on themselves like fists. I adjusted a few drip lines, checked the well pressure, and thought again about adding another holding tank. But the heat made me slow, sluggish, wary. I heard it before I saw it. A distant crack like a whip followed by a low thrum that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I turned toward the canyon ridge and scanned the horizon. At first, it looked like nothing more than a heat shimmer. Then it shifted, thickened, turned brown. Smoke, thin, fast-moving, curling upward like a ribbon in the sky. I dropped the clipboard and ran my knees, angry with every stride, back to the house where I grabbed the old scanner radio I kept in the mudroom. I hadn't used it in years, but the static that poured through was instantly familiar. Brush fire near Dry Creek Road, spreading northeast. High winds reported. Multiple calls coming in from Ridgepoint Estates. Ridgepoint Estates, that was us. I stared at the radio heart pounding in my ears. I knew the terrain. I knew the patterns. If the fire had jumped the canyon and the wind was pushing it northeast, then it was heading straight for the backlots of the HOA subdivision, right toward the homes that had voted to lock their only fire access gate. I grabbed my boots and keys. As I stepped out onto the porch, the acrid scent of burning sage hit me full in the face. My orchard trees swayed slightly uneasy in the wind. I called the fire department. Busy. Called again. Got a dispatcher. This is Daniel Rourke. There's a wildfire moving through the Dry Creek. You need to send engines through the Orchard Road to reach the Eastern Ridge. HOA gate is blocked. The woman on the line paused. Sir, we've received multiple calls. We're deploying Engine 12 and Strike Team Bravo. What gate are you referring to? The one at the back of the Ridgepoint subdivision. They installed it 2 months ago and never filed the access code with the county. I could hear the typing, the shuffling of papers. Sir, that access route is listed as a secondary response lane. It's the fastest response lane, I snapped. And it's about to become the only one. The fire's coming up that ridge like a freight train. If your engines try to come around the western loop, they'll lose at least 15 minutes. I'm telling you. We'll notify the crews. I didn't wait for more. I threw open the barn, grabbed the emergency hose rig I'd built years ago, and started loading barrels of water into the back of my truck. My muscles burned with the effort, but adrenaline kept me going. I tied a fire rake and shovel to the truck bed and climbed in. As I turned onto the gravel path, smoke rolled low across the hills, thick and choking. The sun was nothing more than an angry red smudge behind it. And then, as I reached the far end of the Orchard Road, I saw them. 2 HOA board members standing behind the gate, eyes wide with panic. Craig Winthrop and one of his lapdogs, Bradley, something waving their arms frantically, faces bright with fear. I slammed the truck into park and jumped out. Daniel Craig Winthrop shouted, voice cracking, "Open it! You've got to open the gate!" I stalked up to them, smoke curling around our legs. "I told you this would happen," I said. "I warned you. We can't find the key fob. The battery's dead. Just open it." "The access code." "We never submitted one. You had 2 months." "Please," Craig Winthrop said, voice trembling. "There are children in those homes. People are trapped." Behind them, flames were starting to crest the ridge, sharp, angry tongues of fire licking at the brush. The wind howled through the dry grass, turning embers into missiles. I could already hear the first sirens, distant and lost, on the far road where the trucks had been forced to detour. I ran to the keypad. The screen was blank. Dead. Fried from the heat, or the smoke, or bad wiring, I didn't care. I grabbed my crowbar from the truck and started swinging. Steel screamed under the force of it, and for a moment I thought it wouldn't budge. Then the hinge gave way with a sharp pop, and the gate tilted just enough for me to force it open a few feet. "Get back," I shouted. Craig Winthrop and Bradley stumbled out of the way as I rammed my truck through, splintering the rest of the gate and clearing the lane. Behind us, the fire was beginning its descent. I turned to the 2 men, both now coughing, sweat pouring down their faces. "You've got 10 minutes before this whole slope is an inferno," I barked. "Evacuate everyone on this street. Now." They didn't argue. They ran. For the next 20 minutes, I drove house to house, laying on my horn, yelling through open windows, banging on doors. I found an elderly woman who couldn't walk and carried her to my truck. A mother with 3 kids and a parakeet cage. A man in a neck brace dragging his feet across the pavement with tears in his eyes. The first fire engine roared through the broken gate, at last its tires spitting gravel. The captain inside looked at me and gave a sharp nod. "Rourke. Yeah, appreciate the access. You're late. Tell me about it." And then, they were off hoses, hissing crews moving faster than they should have needed to because time was gone, stolen by a locked gate and bureaucratic pride. By nightfall, the flames had been pushed back, but not before 3 homes were destroyed and 2 more severely damaged. And not before the neighborhood realized exactly what they had done. They'd closed the road, and the fire had come. The next morning, the sky was a dull gray, still choked with soot and ash. The hills to the east were blackened, stripped bare like bones after a cremation. Every tree, every shrub along that canyon ridge was gone, scorched down to its roots. My orchard somehow had been spared. The fire had reached the edge of the irrigation ditch, but hadn't crossed. The trees, though singed, stood tall branches heavy with half-grown fruit leaves dusted in ash like powdered sugar on burnt toast. But across the gate, the one I had shattered with my crowbar just hours before, the neighborhood told a different story. Charred rooftops, melted plastic siding, cracked windows, front lawns that had been pristine just a day earlier now looked like something from a war zone. I stood at the broken gatepost, arms folded, watching as homeowners walked their streets in stunned silence. Some held garden hoses, still dripping. Others just stood beside their driveways, not saying a word. Then Craig Winthrop arrived. His shirt was wrinkled and stained with smoke, and he was missing one shoe. He looked like a man who had been dragged through his own bad decisions. His eyes darted between the wreckage and me. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at the ruined gate and the blackened hills beyond, then back to me. "Daniel," he finally muttered, throat dry. I didn't move. "You're lucky." He flinched. "I mean it," I continued. "You're lucky it wasn't worse. Lucky the wind turned when it did. Lucky Engine 12 had an off-duty captain who knew the Orchard Road still existed. And lucky I was here when you called." He cleared his throat. I wanted to say thank you. I let that hang in the air. He swallowed, and I wanted to apologize for everything. I stared at him. "Everything, huh?" His jaw worked, as if trying to chew the words before speaking them. I knew we were pushing boundaries when we installed that gate. But we were getting pressure from the residents' privacy concerns, you know. Crime rates, too. "Show me the crime reports," I said flatly. He blinked. "You can't, because there weren't any." You weaponized fear to justify control. You ignored fire code warnings. You refused to file the access code with the county. And when I brought you documents, you shredded them with violation notices. I didn't shred. Don't. My voice dropped low. You want to apologize? Start by telling the truth. Craig Winthrop stared at the ground. Behind him, another homeowner approached Bradley. He looked about as bad as Craig Winthrop did, with soot in his hair and a dazed look in his eyes. We could have died, he said, voice trembling. My daughter. She was trapped. We couldn't get the gate open. We couldn't even get a signal for 10 minutes. I didn't say anything, just looked between them and waited. We need to remove the gate permanently, Craig Winthrop said, his voice small. I raised an eyebrow. We already held an emergency vote this morning, he continued. We're drafting a motion to eliminate restricted access on all perimeter roads. Full transparency. Fire department access at all times. You think that's enough? He looked up at me. What more can we do? I pulled the folded violation letters from my pocket, creased and soot-stained, and held them up. These were never about safety. They were about silencing. You used these like weapons against the one person who knew what was coming. Craig Winthrop didn't answer. You want to fix this, I said, voice tight. Then you go to every single resident who signed that petition. You explain to them how your decision put lives at risk. You tell them about the delay the engines forced to reroute the homes that burned because of your pride. I will, he said quickly. I'll write it up. I'll put it in the newsletter. No, I snapped. You'll say it. In person. At the next town meeting. With me sitting right in front. Craig Winthrop hesitated, then nodded. Bradley shifted. Daniel, I never knew about the fire you went through. The one you talked about. I didn't realize it was real. It was real, I said. And so was this one. A silence passed between us, the weight of what had nearly happened still settling into their bones. I turned to leave. Wait, Craig Winthrop called after me. What made you open the gate? I paused, looked back. I thought about doing nothing, I admitted, letting you sit behind that gate and watch the fire come. Letting you understand fully what happens when you cut off a lifeline. Why didn't you? I exhaled. Because you're not the only ones who live here. There were children, elderly, people who had no idea what decisions you'd made for them. I wasn't going to let them pay for your arrogance. He looked away again, this time ashamed. And because I added somewhere up there, I pointed to the charred hill a little boy named Eli Simmons might have been watching. And I wasn't going to let him down again. I left them standing there. Back at the orchard, I collapsed onto the porch steps and finally let my shoulders drop. For the first time in weeks, I felt my ribs actually expand with a full breath. The ash still hung thick in the air, but it was nothing compared to the weight that had lifted from my chest. Later that day, I received a message from the county fire chief. They wanted me to speak at the next emergency planning forum. Talk about what happened. Use the Ridgepoint fire as a case study in how HOA decisions could cost lives. They wanted to rewrite guidelines to ensure access codes were mandatory for all future developments. I said yes, because that gate was never just about a road. It was about what we choose to protect and what we choose to lock out. And in their hour of crisis, the very people who tried to silence me had screamed for the one thing they worked hardest to destroy: connection. Long after the embers died, the damage remained. The fire had been classified as a Tier 2 Wildland Urban Interface Event, a term I'd seen in dozens of incident reports, but never thought would apply to my own neighborhood. The final count was sobering: 3 homes destroyed, 6 damaged, 2 residents hospitalized from smoke inhalation, and countless others displaced while structural assessments were underway. But what stood out the most in the after-action reports, the thing that was circled, underlined, and highlighted in red, was the same sentence repeated again and again. Delayed access due to locked gate on Orchard Road. Estimated delay 18 minutes. 18 minutes. That's a lifetime in a fire. The district chief later told me that by the time Engine 12 reached the Ridgepoint perimeter, they were forced to double back almost a full mile to reach the main entrance. Traffic from panicked residents trying to flee clogged the loop road. Some homeowners had abandoned their cars halfway up the slope, desperate to escape on foot. Crews had to weave between vehicles just to position their hoses. Worse, the winds had shifted just as predicted, fanning flames directly into the cul-de-sac closest to the locked gate. They arrived just in time to stop the fire from taking the entire block, but not in time to save what had already been lost. I drove past those homes the next day, slow and silent, like passing a battlefield. One house was reduced to a blackened foundation with 2 chimney columns still standing. Another had its entire garage collapsed inward, a melted frame of what used to be a Tesla sagging into the concrete like tar. In front of the third house stood a girl maybe 12 holding a garden rake, with both hands as if she might somehow sweep the ashes back into shape. I pulled over. "Hey," I said gently, "you okay?" She turned, face streaked with soot eyes, red and swollen. "I was trying to clean the driveway," she said. "My mom says the insurance people are coming." "You don't have to do that," I told her. "They'll understand." She nodded but didn't stop. I walked up and took the rake from her, set it gently against the curb. "What's your name?" "Maya." "I'm Daniel. I live just past the orchard." Her eyes widened. "The road. You're the guy who opened the road." "I am." She threw her arms around me without warning. It hit me like a gut punch. Not the hug itself, but what it meant. The silent gratitude of someone who knew how close they'd come to never leaving that house. Who didn't care about politics or gates or HOA bylaws. Just that someone, anyone, had done something when it counted. I sat on the curb with her for a few minutes, not saying much. Just listening to the wind rustle through the burned-out remnants of what had once been home. When I finally got back to my place, there was a voicemail waiting on my landline. Denise Morales. "Daniel, it's me. Just wanted to give you a heads up, media's all over this. They're requesting interviews, especially about the fire access issue. Also, the HOA's lawyer reached out. They're asking if you'd be willing to mediate before this goes to court." I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. Court, of course, because it always comes to that when paper meets power. But this time, the facts weren't on their side. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. It was as carefully worded as you'd expect. "Dear Mr. Rourke, in light of the recent emergency event, the Ridgepoint HOA would like to discuss a resolution regarding the orchard access gate and other mutual concerns. We recognize that miscommunications may have occurred and hope to move forward with a spirit of collaboration and community safety." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I went to the county meeting scheduled 2 days later. The chamber was packed, residents, firefighters, reporters, even a few city officials from neighboring districts. The Ridgepoint fire had made the news not just for the damage, but because it raised a broader question. How many other HOAs were blocking access in the name of privacy? When my name was called, I stood behind the microphone and unfolded the map I'd brought, a satellite view of the Ridgepoint subdivision with the Orchard Road marked in thick red ink. This, I said pointing, was the fastest route for emergency crews to reach the eastern side of our community. I let the silence linger. "And this," I added, tapping the red square over the locked gate, "is what delayed them by 18 minutes. I spoke for 12 minutes, not as a landowner, not as a victim, but as a retired fire marshal who had spent most of his life trying to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. When I finished, I folded the map, nodded to the council, and walked back to my seat. People clapped. Not politely, not perfunctorily, but the kind of clap that starts slow and grows not just for me, but for the truth finally spoken aloud. After the meeting, a woman from the adjacent neighborhood approached me. She introduced herself as chair of the Green Valley HOA. "We've had a similar situation," she said. "A gate installed last year over a utility easement. After your story, we're opening it permanently." That was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. A ripple. Within a week, a local reporter ran an exposé titled, "When Safety Meets Secrecy: How HOAs Are Blocking Emergency Services," featuring photos of the burned homes, quotes from firefighters, and my testimony. And just like that, what started as one gate became a conversation across the entire county. The Ridgepoint HOA, under pressure from residents and legal risk, issued a formal statement. "We acknowledge that recent actions may have compromised safety. We are committed to re-evaluating all infrastructure decisions and will work directly with emergency services to ensure full compliance moving forward." Craig Winthrop stepped down as president. Bradley resigned entirely. A new board was being formed, one that, according to the rumors, would include someone with actual emergency management experience. Someone like me. I wasn't sure I wanted the job, but I was sure of this. People had finally seen what happens when access is treated like a privilege instead of a right. When the need for control trumps the need for compassion. when the loudest voices in the room belonged to people with the least understanding of risk. The fire had taken homes, but it had also burned away the illusion that silence was safer than standing up. And now there was no going back. By the end of the week, Ridgepoint wasn't just the name of a subdivision anymore. It had become a headline. HOA Gate delayed firefighters in blaze that destroyed homes. Residents blame HOA for blocking access during wildfire. Private gate public risk when homeowner associations go too far. It was on every news ticker, every local talk radio program, every community blog in the region. My phone didn't stop ringing for days. Reporters, legal aid groups, public safety consultants. Even a state senator's office reached out asking if I'd be willing to provide insight on new legislation being drafted to prevent similar tragedies. I hadn't planned on becoming the face of HOA accountability. Hell, I hadn't even wanted the fight to begin with. But once it found me, it wasn't letting go. The fire had done more than burn structures. It had exposed the deep rot beneath the surface of the HOA system. The arrogance, the unchecked power, the weaponization of rules against reason. And now the public wanted answers. It started with the insurance companies. 2 of the destroyed homes were owned by families who had filed complaints against the Ridgepoint HOA prior to the fire concerns specifically related to evacuation access. One of them had even emailed the board asking if there were alternate exit plans in case of a wildfire. That email was never answered. Now their insurers were requesting full documentation of all HOA infrastructure changes in the last year. Then came the county. The fire marshal's office launched an internal review of every neighborhood with private access gates. They wanted maps, code registration logs, fire access, override plans. Most HOAs had none. Ridgepoint was cited first listed for immediate compliance remediation. The report referenced the Orchard Road incident 5 times in bold. Meanwhile, Denise Morales called with a tone in her voice I hadn't heard before, something between vindication and warning. "They're circling the wagons, Daniel," she said. Ridgepoint just hired a crisis management firm out of LA. Their statement yesterday tried to spin the fire as a freak natural disaster and claimed the access road delay was minimal. It wasn't minimal. I know. The county knows, but they're panicking. I've got 3 law firms reviewing the case now. Class action may be on the table. Against the HOA. She hesitated. Against individual board members, too. You know what that means. It meant Craig Winthrop, Bradley. Every signature on that original petition to close the road. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "I never wanted that," I said. "I just wanted the damn gate open." She sighed. "Yeah. But now there's a fire trail and a paper trail. And both lead straight to their decisions." The next town hall meeting was standing room only. Not just Ridgepoint residents, but people from other HOA communities. Fire crews, lawyers, reporters with notepads in their laps. Craig Winthrop wasn't there. Bradley wasn't either. But the remaining board members sat stiffly at the front table, shifting in their seats as people lined up to speak. One woman held up a photo of her 2 kids standing in front of their burned house, tears streaking her face as she described the terror of not knowing whether the fire trucks would reach them in time. Another man, older and soft-spoken, read aloud from a letter he wrote to the board 2 months earlier, begging them not to close the Orchard Road. "You ignored me," he said. "And now my wife sleeps on a cot in a shelter while we wait for a structural assessment." Then they called my name. I stepped up to the podium and looked out at the room full of people who just weeks ago had seen me as an enemy. "I'm not here to say, 'I told you so,'" I began. "I'm here to say it never should have come to this." I recounted everything, how I warned. The board showed them fire codes, shared my history, tried every legal and civil avenue before the fire ever came. I didn't yell. I didn't dramatize. I just told the truth. Old access isn't a luxury, I said. It's not a political pawn. It's a lifeline. And the second you treat it like anything less, you endanger everyone, your family, your neighbors, even yourselves. Someone in the back of the room clapped. Then more. Then the whole room. Afterward, 2 reporters approached. One was from the local news station, the other from the State Bureau of Fire Prevention. They asked if I'd be willing to give a formal statement for an upcoming documentary series on climate risk and community safety. I said yes. And just like that, I became more than a homeowner with a crowbar and a conscience. I became a case study. A week later, Denise Morales called again. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Ridgepoint just offered to settle publicly. They want to issue a full apology, remove the gate, and establish a safety committee with you as its chair. They want me on the board, I asked. They want you leading the reforms. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. Me, the guy they once tried to fine for having a tractor near the orchard fence. The guy they smeared in newsletters. The man they all ignored until they smelled the smoke for themselves. I said I'd consider it. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my orchard, watching the stars blink through the haze. Somewhere out there on the blackened ridge, the earth was still smoldering raw, wounded, but ready to heal. The same could be said for the people. Not all of them, not yet, but some. The anger was turning into action, the fear into dialogue, and the silence that had finally been broken. This wasn't just about Ridgepoint anymore. Other HOAs were being audited. State legislation was being drafted. A fire that should have ended in tragedy had somehow sparked a movement, all because someone dared to say, "This is wrong, and I won't let it stand." The letter arrived by certified mail, hand-delivered by a county clerk, with a badge clipped to her belt and a clipboard in her hand. She didn't say much, just asked me to sign the receipt, handed me the envelope, and walked back down my gravel driveway like she'd done this 1,000 times before. I stood there for a minute, envelope in hand, before opening it. Inside was a subpoena. The County of Ventura requests your sworn testimony before the grand jury in the matter of HOA obstruction and negligence related to the Ridgepoint fire incident. I sat down on my porch and stared at the wording. It wasn't unexpected. The investigators had been circling for weeks, collecting statements, pulling footage, interviewing witnesses. The fire hadn't just taken down homes, it had pulled the rug out from under a powerful HOA that operated like a private kingdom for years. And now, finally, someone had asked the question that too many of us had shouted into the void for too long. What happens when a neighborhood is governed by people with no accountability? Apparently the grand jury met in a small windowless building in downtown Ventura. There was no fanfare, no flags waving, no courtroom theatrics, just a panel of 12 citizens. 2 prosecutors, a stenographer, and me, dressed in a clean shirt and jeans, holding a binder full of documents and drone photos. I was sworn in under oath. Then they asked me to tell them everything. I started from the beginning. How I'd bought the land, maintained the Orchard Road for nearly 2 decades, and watched as Ridgepoint grew from a sleepy cul-de-sac into a manicured maze of stucco homes, all governed by a board that seemed more concerned with hedges and holiday decorations than safety or common sense. I told them about the gate, the sudden installation, the lack of warning, the way the HOA had claimed jurisdiction over an easement that didn't belong to them. I told them about my warnings, the fire code maps, the ignored letters, the threats, the violations they sent me like little arrows dipped in arrogance. I walked them through the morning of the fire, the smoke, the delay, the panicked calls. The moment I took a crowbar to the gate because it was the only way to save the people on the other side. And then I paused. I reached into my binder and pulled out a small laminated photo. It was old edges, curled slightly from years in my wallet. A boy, maybe 6 years old, smiling in front of a red tricycle. The corners of his eyes crinkled with laughter. "This was Eli Simmons," I said quietly. "He died in a house fire 26 years ago because our engine couldn't get through a private gate. His mother screamed for us to save him, but we were too late." No one said a word. I carry his picture because I promised myself I'd never let access stand between a fire crew and a child again. The foreperson leaned forward. "Mr. Rourke, do you believe the Ridgepoint HOA board members knowingly endangered residents by blocking the Orchard Road?" "Yes," I said. "They were warned repeatedly. They received written notice of the risk. They failed to comply with county fire code, failed to provide emergency access information, and retaliated against me for raising concerns. Do you believe their actions contributed to the destruction of property and delay in emergency response?" "I don't believe it," I said. "I know it." They asked for the binder. I handed it over, filled with time-stamped photos, emails, scanned violation notices, fire maps, aerial imagery from my drone, and a log of every call I made before and after the fire. I walked out of that room, lighter than I'd been in weeks. Outside, the air still smelled faintly of smoke, like the land hadn't quite finished grieving. I got into my truck and drove home the long way through the canyon roads that had once been charred black and now were dotted with signs of green, returning tiny shoots breaking through the ash. A few days later, I got a call from Denise Morales. They're moving forward, she said. The district attorney is preparing charges, criminal negligence, obstruction of emergency response, even perjury for some of the paperwork they submitted to the city. I didn't speak. Craig Winthrop is going to be subpoenaed. Bradley, too. At least 3 other board members may face civil suits. And the community. She hesitated. Some are angry, some are relieved. Most are just shocked it came to this. Let's hope it doesn't happen again. It won't. Not with you on that board. That same week, I was officially voted onto the Ridgepoint Emergency Preparedness Committee, a newly formed body independent of the HOA Board, but with full authority to coordinate safety measures, fire drills, access audits, and future infrastructure plans. And that was just the start. The Fire Marshal's office released a revised fire access protocol for all private neighborhoods in the county. Any gated community that restricted secondary access routes without compliance documentation would now be in direct violation of public safety code. State officials reached out next. They were drafting a bill nicknamed Eli's Law to make emergency access overrides mandatory for all HOA-controlled roads in fire-prone zones. I was asked to speak at the committee hearing. I brought the same binder, held up the same photo, told the same story. And this time the lawmakers listened, because something had changed in the air, not just from the fire, but from the way people had begun to see what really mattered. That privacy wasn't worth a child's life. That power without wisdom was just a spark waiting to catch. That silence was no longer an option. Weeks later, I received another letter. But this one wasn't a violation or a subpoena. It was from Maya, the girl I'd sat beside on the curb outside her burned home. It was written in pencil, carefully folded. Dear Mr. Rourke, thank you for saving our neighborhood. I heard you went to court. I think you're very brave. My mom says the fire was scary, but that you helped stop it. I hope you grow the best peaches ever. Love, Maya. I read it 3 times. Then I walked out into the orchard and started tying new irrigation lines beneath the younger trees lines that had melted during the fire. My hands were calloused. My back ached, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Because finally, after all these years, the road was open. The orchard road looks different now. Not because the trees have changed, the peaches are still sweet, the branches still heavy in late summer, but because the road for the first time in years feels truly open. Not just physically, but in spirit. There's no more gate, no keypad, no warning signs with smug language about private access or trespassers will be fined. Instead, there's a new sign at the trailhead green with white lettering approved by both the county and the fire marshal's office. It reads, Emergency access route do not block. Community maintained. Publicly shared. In honor of Eli Simmons. Every time I drive past it, I feel a strange mix of sadness and pride. Grief and grace. A reminder of what we lost and what we refused to lose again. It's been 4 months since the fire. The Ridgepoint community is still rebuilding slowly, painfully, but with a clarity they never had before. Gone are the HOA newsletters filled with enforcement updates and landscaping guidelines. In their place are evacuation maps, safety workshops, and genuine invitations to collaborate. The new HOA board includes 3 fresh faces, none of them from the old guard. Craig Winthrop was formally removed after the grand jury findings. He's facing 2 civil suits and 1 count of criminal negligence. Last I heard, he moved to a condo in another city and hired a crisis PR team to help rebuild his image. Bradley took a different route. He showed up at my orchard one morning just after sunrise. I was pulling a tarp over one of the older irrigation tanks when I saw his truck roll up the drive. My first instinct was tension, but something in his posture disarmed me. He got out quietly. No clipboard. No attitude, just a plain t-shirt and jeans and a tired look in his eyes. Can I talk to you? He asked. I nodded slowly. He stood there for a long moment before speaking. I've been volunteering with the recovery team, helping rebuild homes. That's good, I said. He looked down. I wanted to apologize, properly. Not just for the gate, for how we treated you, for how I treated you. I let the silence hang between us, not out of spite, but because it felt honest. I didn't know about Eli Simmons, he added, voice thin. Didn't know why it mattered so much to you. I thought you were just angry. I said. But not at you. He nodded. Still, I'm sorry. If you ever need help out here. He let the offer trail off, but I heard it. We shook hands. It didn't undo what had happened, but it was something. Later that week, the Ridgepoint community held a gathering, not a formal meeting, not a vote, but a genuine potluck on the big lawn by the clubhouse. Kids ran barefoot through the grass, music played low from someone's speaker, and tables were set up with home-cooked dishes, fresh fruit, and big jugs of lemonade. I brought a crate of peaches. No one questioned whether I was allowed to be there. No one asked if my fruit stand had proper HOA approval. They just smiled, took a peach, and said thank you. A woman named Erin, who used to cross the street to avoid me, came up and hugged me. My husband and I never signed that petition, she said. But we didn't speak up either. I'm sorry for that. It's okay, I said. You're speaking now. A boy I didn't recognize, maybe 9 or 10, ran up to me with a crayon drawing in his hands. It was a picture of a road cutting through a forest with flames on one side and water trucks on the other. In the middle was a man holding a gate wide open. That's you, he said proudly. I almost cried. Instead, I knelt down and asked if I could keep it. It's taped to my fridge now. That night, I stood at the edge of the orchard, again watching the moonlight dust the leaves in silver. I thought about how close we came to losing everything, not just homes or lives, but trust, connection. The fragile thread that holds a neighborhood together. The fire had burned away more than wood and drywall. It had incinerated the illusions we all carried, that rules make a community safe, that silence keeps peace, that gates keep danger out. The truth is, danger doesn't come from the outside. It's born inside fences, inside apathy, inside the quiet moments where good people choose not to act. But so is courage, so is redemption. And as I watched the stars blink overhead, I knew for the first time in years that this place was becoming a community again. Not because the HOA said so, not because of rules or newsletters, but because people had seen, and because they'd finally chosen to care. A few weeks later, I stood before the county board as they passed Eli's Law. Into effect unanimously. The room erupted into applause, and I felt a warmth in my chest that no fire could burn away. Afterward, Maya and her mother found me in the hallway. We're moving back, her mom said. Our new house will be on the same lot, rebuilt from the ground up. Maya held out a small jar filled with peach jam. It's from your orchard, she said shyly. We picked the fruit during the community day. I took it gently. It weighed more than a jar of jam ever should, because it was more than fruit. It was proof that something sweet could still grow from the ashes, that maybe just maybe gates don't need to be locked to keep people safe. Sometimes they need to be opened wide and left that way forever.